Hey guys, today we're going to go over a presentation that was originally given at Stanford and was supposed to be given at the Cell-Based Meat Summit in San Francisco earlier this year, but I was ultimately not able to go, so we're going to sort of share this publicly here. So we start really fundamentally with the presentation, start with this sort of topic of ethics. We can think of it as essentially just meaning how should we act as people with moral agency and who consider if their decisions are right or wrong decisions. And I say it's misunderstood because I think it really should be thought of very similar to how law is thought of, which is that legal claims must be based on legal frameworks. You know, if you look at law in India or China or the US, there's obviously different laws. And if you were in any of these places, it would be really unreasonable or really not a rational thing to say to go to one of these places and say, see an action and say, that's illegal, without knowing the law beforehand, right? Saying something is legal is based on a legal framework that you're suggesting it's tied to. So the same actually goes for ethics. So when we think about cell-based meat, and if it's ethical that we should ultimately transition to a system like this, we have to think about under what framework is that an argument that we would be making. So we'll start just with these 4 examples of ethical theories that, sort of guide moral action. So the first is virtue ethics, right? And virtue ethics are essentially just person-based ethics. What are virtuous actions for someone to take? The second is theologically based ethics, religious ethics, which are just obviously tied to a particular religion, right? Islam, Christianity have sort of different codes of action that are suggested within the religions, just as an example, and I think that the range is really wide there. Deontological ethics are duty-based ethics. What duties do we have to other people? And that's what's tied to moral action in that case. And then last is consequence-based ethics, utilitarian ethics, which are consequence-based ethics. So let's think and sort of tie it back to cell-based meat for a moment and what different arguments might be when it comes to each one of these ethical theories. So the first is virtue ethics, and someone might argue that, or a virtue ethicist might say that moving towards a system of cell-based meat because it would solve some of the issues of animal agriculture would be a compassionate, fair, and merciful move to make, and that would be perhaps something that they would argue. Maybe someone who followed the Christian faith would argue, sort of using Genesis 1:28 here, that, and God said unto them, be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the earth. Or, if we want to follow an Islamic position, we could say, eat and drink, but waste not excess, for Allah loves not the wasters. Really, for both of these, how it ties to cell-based meat is we could say that it's tied to the environmental problems with animal agriculture, and that's how both of these sentiments would be ultimately tied to cell-based meat. Third is deontological ethics, and that someone might argue who follows such a ethical theory that we should be opposed to animal exploitation because we have a responsibility towards animals. And then lastly, a utilitarian would suggest that we should just be generally opposed to animal suffering and that we have a responsibility towards harm reduction in that regard. Not to mention, you're going to hear a lot when it comes to the arguments of cell-based meat that it can eliminate factory farming and some of these issues that can be negative for animals, but they're negative for animals. And most people are suggesting just that they're suffering in those experiences. So utilitarianism is the one that focuses on suffering, so that's why I think it's relevant too. So let's do a utilitarian-based ethical analysis on cell-based meat. So we obviously have to think about an action and how that action influences pleasure and suffering on a sentient organism. And by sentient organism, I literally just mean any organism that has the capacity to feel either pleasure or suffering in that binary system. So in this case, the action is moving towards a system of cell-based meat, and the question mark is, in what regard will that have an impact on pleasure or suffering on particular sentient organisms? So let's think about sort of the slogan of CAS, people, animals, world, and we'll focus on people and sort of public health in this first regard. And someone might argue a positive aspect and how it would contribute to the sort of pleasure side, either increasing pleasure or reducing suffering on the positive side, sort of two-prong approach here. And then on the other side, another two-prong approach, it would be, and the negative list would be that we're decreasing pleasure and increasing suffering, right? So either of those would sort of, and there's definitely deeper arguments. I think you can go into all this, and I'm not going to make this a philosophy course, but we're just going to keep this at a relatively surface level. So on the positive side, we can say that it curbs antibiotic resistance, right? And we can feed an increasing global population. That could be a argument on how it could increase pleasure or reduce suffering. And on the negative side, we could say that it continues meat-centric diets, which contributes to adverse health effects. And I think this is, mainly an argument that would be pushed by the vegan community, but, something that someone would definitely argue is a negative side of promoting cell-based meat over animal-based meat. Or some people think that we should just be completely vegetarians or vegans and sort of move to a plant-based system. But moving on, I think the sort of environmental argument for a positive would be that conserving natural resources is a positive thing. However, if we're looking at this again, and we are in utilitarian-based ethical analysis, it's not really reasonable to say, oh, we're just because we can not cut down as many trees, that's a positive. We're worried about suffering and pleasure here, and from what I've seen, there's no research to suggest a tree in a forest is in like agony or something, right, when it's being cut down. So. Forests provide shelter to wildlife, and because you're taking down trees, for example, you could be harming wildlife, which are sentient organisms. So conserve natural resources, but only positive insofar as it benefits sentient organisms. That could be a positive argument for transitioning away from an animal agriculture-based system, which causes issues like deforestation like that. Moving on, the sort of negative side of the environmental argument is that there would be job loss for those who are working in those resource production industries, right? There are obviously people who work to... really in any regard. I just use deforestation as an example here, but there certainly would be job loss there, and I think that's a negative. And lastly, sort of, I think what most people think of as an obvious one is that you could reduce animal farming, which would in turn reduce the quantity of animals that are born into intensive animal agriculture, which I think the evidence is quite clear. There is certainly sufferable experiences happening there at grand scale. A negative argument, though, and again, I think a myth that's often portrayed by those in the sort of animal advocacy and vegan community, is that every animal in a farming system is enduring this tremendous form of suffering, and that just isn't the case. There are certainly farms that don't conduct their practices like that. I certainly won't say they're the majority by any stretch of the imagination, but there are farms like that. So. You could definitely argue that as demand for animal-based products goes down, and if cell ag were to be the status quo method of meat production, that you would not have those animals born, and some of them wouldn't be born into a system where they would not be having such a sufferable existence. However, sort of rebut that point of a negative, most animals would be sort of avoided in existence that would be quite sufferable. So that's sort of a back and forth on how we could be looking at this. However, it's especially when it's something as grand scale as this. I mean, you have simpler analyses that you could do, but this is a transitioning an entire system from one to definitely a different one. And there are really thousands of these that you could consider, whether they're bad or good, and how that would interplay. So we're just going to assume, and for someone like me who's probably given this a good amount of thought, and I think I have come to the conclusion that this is a largely better thing to do than to leave the system as is or move towards a plant-based system or something like that, that if we did move towards a cell ag system, transition animal agriculture to cellular agriculture, that would be a largely positive thing under a utilitarian perspective. And so our conclusion here can be that cell-based meat, due to its complex nature integrating with diverse topic areas, calls for a multidimensional approach towards analyzing its ethical prospects. And so I guess I'm adding on to here that I think it generally would be a positive thing, but to keep this objective, that is, the reality, that I think we just should take a multidimensional approach and make an evaluation from there. So let's move on and think about, now that we've settled that we are going to think about how we could move towards a system of cellular agriculture, there are considerations for how consumer acceptance, or just how this would be successful overall. And those considerations, quite honestly, are limited when you think about a domestic market, really, if we just thought about how we could make cell-based meat the status quo in the US. But if we thought outside the US and we thought how to make this a global phenomenon, global market commercialization, the entire world is moving towards a cell-based meat system, what things should we be thinking about? So this is sort of the list, and where we'll start breaking down different categories. And we start with a very commonly sort of thought of one in our field, which is nomenclature, and what things should be called. And I'm using sort of this image as an ironic point, not that people should be thinking about it like this, but a lot of people are and think about it. And a lot of terms have been thrown around, like lab-grown meat, test tube meat. So look, another thing most people would argue, I'm going to tell you my experience. What I think most people in our field would agree are sort of the timelines for when certain names were being used in terminology. And so we can start with cultured meat, which was, I'll just say, roughly the 2000s to 2016, where this was the term that people would use in our field and stakeholders for referring to this concept, or meat that's grown from animal cells, real meat that's grown from animal cells instead of from raising and slaughtering animals. So kosher meat was 2000 to 2016, and then I'd say we had sort of the clean meat era from 2016 to 2018. Sort of today, or 2018 and now, we're in the sort of cell-based meat era, and that, I mean, you could also really argue we're sort of in the most rogue state, and anarchy, and different companies are using different terms, especially in different countries where there's different language overall. But for the most part, I'd say we were in the sort of cell-based meat era with nomenclature. So it's obvious, though, that a new system is going to require new terminology. So, animal-based meat is to cell-based meat, as vegan is to what, right? I made a term a while ago, but I don't necessarily think that's as productive as I used to. But you could think of that there would be a different term for someone who exclusively consumed these sort of products. You would also think that as animal-based meat is to cell-based meat, slaughterhouse is to what? What would the facility be called? Something we are thinking about, in addition to designing for Project CMF, is the name for this. Next, a good segue, bring up design, is design itself, and just thinking about how certain facilities would ultimately look in a cellular agriculture system. And then packaging is also something interesting that is a design challenge and will influence, I think, the overall success of this. So this is an example from Just. Regulation, obviously really important. I think there's sort of three pillars when it comes to, most people think there's three. If you take all these categories and kind of condense them to three pillars of what needs to be done to make this successful, I think you would probably say regulation, just general R&D, and then consumer acceptance. And a lot of this is lumped into consumer acceptance. So it's actually really interesting. I think it's the same challenges or things that are confronted with autonomous vehicles and driverless cars, is that those three areas are really important as well: regulation, consumer acceptance, and making sure the R&D and the science is where it needs to be. But anyway, back to cell-based meat. So FDA and USDA product safety is obviously really important here. But when we're thinking about regulation, I think it draws onto the question: is it too fragile to withstand an early outbreak? And actually, since we brought up driverless cars, I think it's a good analogy that if driverless cars kill, or human-based cars kill so many people annually, right? And if a driverless system in the next decade or two were to kill substantially less, but it's done by an AI perceived robot, what would the perception be if 100 times less people are killed because we're using a driverless car system over what we have today? Is it seen as better, or is it seen worse because it's not people that are causing the accidents, but it's these programs that we're programming? So I think the same thing comes with cell-based meat, is that salmonella. Well, not salmonella. I think there's over 1 million cases. Yes, this is the case. The CDC says over 1 million people get sick annually from poultry contamination alone. And if there was 100 people that got sick from a cell-based poultry system, would it be seen as better, or it's worse because it's sort of too fragile of a state to have outbreaks like that? So that's just something to think about. I think it's related to regulation. So obviously super related to regulation is politics, right? And so when it comes to politics and how that would sort of have any involvement in cell-based meat, at least we can speak in the United States, that there's obviously polarization. And so I think very similar to climate change, cell-based meat could be subject to partisanship, and sort of, especially with most of the activity at this point happening in the Bay Area, sort of seen as a sort of like left, lab-grown, liberal movement or something along those lines. So that's something else to be thinking about. Next on the list is high-profile endorsements. And so I think it's something to be thinking about, which is if an athlete were to endorse cell-based meat, what would that do for the concept overall? And then if world-class chefs who are actually working with meat on a daily basis were to also endorse cell-based meat, that would also pose some interesting ramifications. So time and money is something else to be thinking about, of course. I think this is pretty obvious, right? Research is resource intensive. There is clearly a correlation between time and money, and how if you throw more money at something, you can perhaps speed up the progress. But ultimately, this is going to be something that at this stage, where sort of R&D is still needed, will impact how cell-based meat comes to global markets. Media hype is really salient too. Thinking about how the press has reflected this concept quite a lot. Especially over in recent years. So will years of hype affect acceptance? The media talks about things like $300,000. This number's been thrown around so much. $300,000, especially with Professor Post, and how that could affect consumer acceptance. I think there's already research that shows people have fears that this will be too expensive, and it might be that number that was scaring people, even though it really has no relevance to what the actual product price point will be when it gets to the mass market. But it's something that was talked about so frequently by the press, and I guess still is, and so that could affect how this ultimately is successful. And then also there's this notion that it's just a few years away. So I want to point out this one article in 2005 where, and to be fair, this is not the only one. There are other articles that said made claims like this, where they said, in a few years' time, there may be lab-grown meat ready to market as sausages or patties. This is 2005. We're almost in 2020, and it's still not there. So this is a problem that people are thinking it's always a few years away. It's almost like nuclear fusion or something. Complexity is maybe, in my opinion, one of the most important things here, because it's not this sort of like cutting a ribbon moment when that date happens and then boom, every single animal product has an exact analog. Instead, first-gen products are just not going to be steaks or complex tissues. They're really going to be, chicken nuggets, unstructured meat, and so that's what the first-gen products will be. And future generation products after that will increase in overall complexity. So I think that will affect how people overall view this and transitioning to it overall. Actually, it's a good segue, because when it comes to tradition, something like a Thanksgiving turkey is not a first-gen product. And so if you imagine it's the year 2027 or, something in that range, and someone is only consumes cell-based meat products, what do they do when it's Thanksgiving? And of course, there's still a turkey, a normal turkey. So that's how tradition would ultimately affect this. And if you think sort of outside the food tradition and just generally tradition, there's generations of livestock farmers that I think need to be considered here, and how that they either would ultimately transition to a cell-based meat system or not. And that's obviously related to tradition and how people are thinking about this, and how it's sort of changing tradition that's lasted for so many years. Related to farmers is industry support. So I think a lot of people think about just the sort of meat industry as this one entity, and it's really not. I mean, if we think about how corporations might ultimately think about the field, I think it would be generally positive. It's they sort of are contracting out farmers to match a certain amount of meat to be produced, and that would just transition. But if you have other people, other stakeholders in this kind of space, and so factory farm workers and slaughterhouse workers obviously won't have a place within a cell-based meat system. Corn and soy producers, which an immense amount goes to feed animals. Now, the whole conversation of what would actually go in the media to feed cells could change, what I'm about to say, but ultimately that the people working in that industry certainly wouldn't have a positive perception if the demand went seriously down. And then lastly, we talk about how many antibiotics are used within animal agriculture. Well, antibiotic producers are creating those, and if you eliminate that, then you have to cut that down as well. Religion is also something that's really important to think about as well. There are obviously dietary guidelines for major world religions, and just to go over a few of them: porcine meat within Islam, within Judaism, something like catfish, and then Hinduism, bovine meat. And so, will these dietary guidelines have sort of different perceptions when it comes to meat that comes from cells instead of slaughtering animals? Which has never been done before, right? For as long as these religions have existed. So nation development is something that's also really important when we think about how we can get to a global scale of moving the entire market that direction. So there's a longer path to market. It kind of goes without saying. If you think it's something, there are obviously clear differences between, I guess, not only CAS, but sort of the concept of cell-based meat and plant-based meat. And I think generally, let's say, so the vegan movement behind plant-based meat and how it's very anti-meat, and cell-based meat is pro-meat. But it is a good example for how they're sort of years ahead. And so something like the Impossible Burger, I think, is maybe a good example on how that perhaps is increasing in its exposure here in the United States, but isn't as much so in a place in just a lower economic region around the world. So that is likely the same thing that will happen for cell-based meat, but to get everywhere eventually will just take time, and will take, and there's a lot of factors to be thought of, including that labor is more expensive in cell ag for local facilities if you want to go by a system like that, which I think is actually a good way to do it, right? I mean, some countries that have smaller amount of land would ultimately be interested, I think, in producing meat locally or I should say domestically, which is something that might have been difficult before with the certain, depending on the meat consumption demand. And then lastly is intersecting technologies. I think intersecting technologies are really important to think about when it comes to, when it comes to us living in a world where technology is increasing in so many different domains. But robotics and artificial intelligence are very likely to play an important role when it comes to cell-based meat being successful, especially artificial intelligence. Virtual and augmented reality will also be something to be thought of. And then lastly, I think a Mars colonization prospect is also extremely interesting because you have maybe two routes, and there are serious plans to colonize Mars in the next couple decades too. And if you think about, I've seen that there's business plans to fund such a project by making it a sort of reality show, and if so, the entire world is watching the first people go to Mars and colonize the planet, and it becomes this sort of cultural fad because they're eating cell-based meat. I think it's really difficult to bring a pig or a farm up in a spaceship, but if they were to bring cell-based meat and that would be how the colony would consume meat, and it was sort of not as popular on Earth, would it be something that influences how people on Earth perceive the concept, and just overall would it move it in that direction? Or on the reverse end, and I don't think this is likely, but if it did, if that was the single reason why, for example, were to wipe out the colony on Mars, I think it would be a really negative thing for people who are perceiving the concept here on Earth. So there's a lot of intersecting technologies that can affect this, and that's something else to think about. So I just tried to culminate a few. Again, this was done a while ago, so I think there certainly may be some things here that were missed, but I think this largely catches what stakeholders in the field should be thinking about when it comes to cell-based meat and consumer considerations for cellular agriculture overall. So our conclusion sort of statement here is that many more variables that must be considered with communal thought and varied perspectives to ensure the greatest likelihood of commercialization. And to sort of bring this full circle, that's considering you've come to the ethical conclusion that we should move in that direction. So that's all we have for today, so we'll catch you next time.